Okay, so we're continuing to look at the accessory organs. And before I move on to liver and gallbladder, I'm going to back up just a minute because I forgot to mention something kind of interesting thing. There was a drug that was brought to market, oh, I don't know, it's been 15 years or so. Because everyone's always looking for a weight loss drug, a magical drug where you can eat all the Oreo cookies you want and still lose weight. So they came out with Orlistat, which was marketed under the product name Ally. I don't know if you know anybody who took this. And what it was a lipase inhibitor. And so if you don't break down fats, then you can't absorb them. I mean, that's true of all the macromolecules. But this one was an inhibitor of the enzyme lipase. And so people who ate fats, their lipase couldn't break them down, so the body couldn't absorb them. The problem is that if you don't break down the fats, or if you don't emulsify them with the bile, then fats will come out the anus in a very unpleasant way. Unpleasant. So people who took this, I think more than being a lipase inhibitor, what it did was it trained you not to eat fat because something very bad would happen later. But that's what this drug did. It was a lipase, well, I don't know if they still sell it, but anyway, it's a lipase inhibitor. Anyway, so what the liver does, the liver's the biggest internal organ. And when we looked at the frog dissection, it was a very multi-lobed organ. Takes up the large part of the body cavity. And the same thing when we look at the pig, it's a very large organ. Sometimes people mistake it for the lungs, although in the mammals it's located below the diaphragm and the lungs are wrapped around the heart above the diaphragm. So it's distinctive if you know where you're supposed to be looking. But in any case, it's definitely the largest organ in the body. It does a lot of things, but in terms of digestion, it secretes bile. So the liver cells are called hepatocytes. In fact, hepata is the root for anything that has to do with the liver. So hepatocytes are liver cells. And the liver cells make bile, and the bile dribbles down from what we call hepatic ducts in tiny amounts to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder collects it. So it kind of dribbles down through the hepatic ducts into this gallbladder, which is kind of a green sac organ. And then when fatty food comes into the duodenum, there is a stimulation, and it's a neural and endocrine combination of reflexes that causes the gallbladder to push the bile into what we call the common bile duct, which lets the bile go down and spray on the food in the duodenum. Bile duct. So, and bile is actually, because of what it contains, it has these bile pigments, and it always has this slightly green coloration, kind of a yellowish green. So the organ, the gallbladder, is usually kind of a yellowish green or a green color. And when you look at models or photos, they always show the gallbladder as green, and that kind of reflects kind of what the color looks like in real life. All right, so what happens once the polymers are broken down into monomer subunits? So amino acids, those are the monomers that are produced from the hydrolysis of proteins. Monosaccharides are produced from the hydrolysis of polysaccharides. And for these two types of monomers, the epithelial cells, the simple epithelium, the enterocytes of the small intestine, which have those microvilli on their surface, the These will be transported into the cytosol. They travel through the cytosol of a cell, and then they are transported across the membrane on the other side. And on the other side of that cell, at least within a reasonable distance, is a blood vessel. So then they move into the blood vessel, and all of the food, everything that's being absorbed and passed into the blood vessel, immediately the blood goes first to the liver. And the liver is a detoxification station, and it picks up excess glucose, and it's really the manager of distribution of all of this stuff that's coming in from the digestive system. In terms of the fats are processed a little bit different. They're not broken down. Well, a triglyceride, which you'll remember, there's like a glycerol backbone and then 3 long-chain fatty acids attached. This is a terrible picture. A triglyceride will be broken down into fatty acids and monoglycerides. A monoglyceride, so 2 of the fatty acids would be cut off and 1 would be left on, and that would be called a monoglyceride. So it's partially broken down, and those diffuse into the epithelial cells still. Of course, that's a diffusion, not a transport. Transport requires like some kind of pore protein or channel protein or transmembrane protein. Diffusion is just direct diffusion across the membrane, and that's because fats are hydrophobic, which the core of the phospholipid bilayer is hydrophobic. So these guys can just pass right into the epithelial cells, but inside the cell they get reassembled, and then they get converted into something called chylomicron. The chylomicrons leave the epithelial cells and go into the lymphatic system, not the blood, not the circulatory system directly. They go into the circulatory system eventually, but first they go into the lymph system. This is where, when the cell is making these chylomicrons, this is where you end up with what we call HDL and LDLs. So part of the metabolism of the fats you'll learn about later in terms of the different forms. All right, so as the chyme is moving through the alimentary canal in the small intestine, these monomer units are being reabsorbed, and also fluid is being reabsorbed. So the chyme is slowly becoming, as it moves along, less and less liquidy. All right, so this, you don't need to memorize all these things, but you have these different enzymes. We talked about amylase, all right. You also have other enzymes that break down other types of sugars. Sucrose is broken down by sucrase. Lactose is broken down by lactase. Maltose is broken down by maltases, or both. Those are all disaccharides. But amylase breaks down starch. So all of these enzymes will break down different types of carbohydrates. Now the protein digestion, this is a little more complicated. In the stomach, the hydrochloric acid denatures the proteins, and then the pepsin starts breaking them down into smaller fragments. In the small intestine, you have the trypsin. So stomach is pepsin, small intestine is trypsin, and that was made by the pancreas and then sprayed into the small intestine, and that also further breaks down the proteins. So by the time you get very far into the small intestine, amino acids are going to be released individually, and then they can be passed across the epithelium into the blood. And then lipids, here's a triglyceride. Oh, that's a much better drawing than what I did before. There's a triglyceride, you may remember that. And lipases will break off 2 of the fatty acids and leave 1 behind. And so the fatty acids and the monoglycerides go across the enterocyte, across the microvilli, part of the membrane, into the cell. They get reprocessed, packaged into chylomicrons. That's a word you got to know. And then passed into the lymph. Lymph is not the blood, so you have the capillary and the lymph. This one goes into the lymph, which eventually drains into the circulatory system at the nodes. You have several parts of the large intestine. So the small intestine, when you get to the end of the ileum, it connects, actually right about here. There's a sphincter here, or a valve. I think it's a valve, but same thing. It's a connector between the last part of the small intestine, the ileum, and the first part of the large intestine. So the material goes up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, and down the descending colon. And then this little S section is called sigmoid, and the part that has the muscles is the rectum. And the contractions of the rectum are involuntary, but the sphincter at the anus is somewhat voluntary. You can learn how to control that when you're 3 years old. All right, so those are the parts. Now, this part here, cecum in humans is very small, and appendix is considered what we call vestigial. These are parts that are not that important to humans. In other animals, the cecum is much larger. Like in the rabbit we saw earlier, you could flip back and see the cecum is actually quite large. Appendix, we don't really know. You know, there's always been speculation about why we have an appendix. It doesn't seem to be that important these days. But maybe in an earlier evolutionary ancestor, it was more important. But in any case, the main function of the large intestine is to reabsorb water. And you have these little, these constrictions here that make these little bands, these little blocks. They're called haustra. And that helps to make the feces into solid, like what we call fecal pellets. All right. So the other thing that happens in large intestine, you do have some normal microbes that live in your large intestine, and some of those make vitamin K. Oops, microbes. How do you spell microbes? Vitamin K is necessary for blood clotting, and so they make the vitamin K that you need. So there's a symbiotic relationship there. And they get some food from your waste. So the large intestine has a very smooth surface, and when you watch the video of the guy who swallows the pill camera, you can see the smooth surface of the large intestine at the very end of the video. So there are no villi and no there might be microvilli. I'll have to double check on that. But the surface at a large level is not ridged. So there's no digestion. There is absorption, but mainly water absorption in the large intestine. And like I said, the vitamin K is produced by some of the bacteria that live in your intestine. The feces are compacted really a lot by those haustra. And they're passed to the rectum via the peristalsis contractions. And like I said, the anus has at least one of the sphincters is voluntary. That's the one you learned how to use when you were 3 years old. There is a lot of increasing amounts of evidence that your diet should be much more plant-based than at least what the American diet is, the Western diet. And so there's various diets, but the real truth, and there's a book by Michael Pollan. It's called In Defense of Food. So if you're interested in nutrition, and it has to do with evolution, and it has to do with, it's science too, but it's all good. Michael Pollan, I think it's spelled like A-N. He has a book called In Defense of Food, and the tagline is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And what he means by eat food is like real food, like you can recognize, like here's a picture and you can recognize what this stuff is. Don't overdo it. Mostly plant-based. So, and when you did your ecological footprint, I bet for some of you, eating too much meat was part of the issue that they suggested you eat less meat. And so ecologically, it'd be better if we ate less meat, or physiologically, it would be better if we ate less meat. I mean, there's so many reasons to eat less meat. But in any case, if you're interested in a good book, kind of nonfiction for the summer, that's a good one. If you're interviewing for med school and they say, what have you been reading lately? You want to have a couple of these things that you can, say something about. And so this is a good one for, general nutrition and scientific view on diet. All right, what about essential nutrients? When we talk about essential nutrients, the definition of these, things that your body cannot make for itself, so you have to get it through your diet. A lot of things your body can make. So your body can convert some amino acids into other amino acids. But there are 9 that you can't make, so you have to get those in your diet. We call those essential. There are some essential vitamins. For example, in this example, apes, monkeys, and guinea pigs can't make vitamin C. So, and we're apes, so we're in that group. Vertebrates can synthesize cholesterol, but some insects cannot. So for them, cholesterol would be important, essential nutrient. And then minerals, you can't make minerals. These are metal atoms. So magnesium, iron, copper, zinc, manganese, other things along that line. So there are some things that you have to get from your diet because your body is not completely self-sufficient in terms of making all the different biomolecules that you need. All right, let's talk about blood glucose regulation. I touched on this a little bit in the previous chapter, but it's so important. And one of the most common diseases and one of the most dangerous diseases is diabetes. And a certain amount of diabetes is, there are some people who have like a metabolic form that they're born with, but a lot of diabetes is just caused by being overweight. And by the way, being overweight gets us back to this: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. People who are overweight are at risk for almost everything. And it's amazing how if somebody lost like 10% of their body weight, like if they're 200 pounds, if they lost 20 pounds, that would be 10%. It actually changes your risk quite a bit for things. So it's not you do have to work at it, but you don't have to change a huge amount to really change your risk group. But anyway, in terms of diabetes, diabetes is, for a lot of people, just the body doesn't make enough insulin. It's almost like the body's worn out, like you've overdone it your whole life and the body just stops, putting out enough insulin. And the problem is when you have a high blood glucose level all the time, and we're talking about the glucose that's actually in your blood, if it doesn't get removed, then it causes damage to everything. And there's reasons for that, but eyes have damage, kidneys get damaged, and kidneys being, eyes are important, but kidneys, you want your kidneys to work until the day you die, because if they stop working, that becomes a misery. So there's a lot of problems that come from diabetes. And so we're just going to talk about how normal people, how their bodies normally would regulate their blood glucose, but there's a defect for people who have diabetes. Okay, so a normal person eats a carbohydrate-rich meal, so something with a lot of starch and sugar. Of course, the starch is broken down by amylase into simple sugars. So when your blood level glucose goes up, right, then your pancreas releases insulin. So here's your pancreas again. How important? Your pancreas is important for digestion. It's important for the blood glucose regulation. And insulin causes the cells to move what we call GLUT4 receptors to the surface of the cell. and that helps bring the glucose in to the cell. And once the glucose is in the cell, then it's no longer in the blood. So it could be any cell, body cells. Muscles and liver tend to pick up glucose quickly, but it's no longer free in the blood plasma. Then we say the blood glucose level goes back down. It's not that the glucose disappears, but it moves into the cells. And so that brings the blood glucose level down. The normal blood glucose level is somewhere around 100 milligrams per deciliter of blood. And that's just kind of a rough number, but I was taught this number because it's easy to remember, 100. You know, it's not a strict number, but it gives you a ballpark. So, you know, when you eat a lot of sugar, it can shoot up quite a bit more than that. But then the insulin release causes the GLUT4 receptors to move to the surface of the cell, the plasma membrane. They open up, the glucose goes into the cell, and that brings the blood glucose back down. Okay, now what happens when you don't eat for a while? Then your blood glucose level goes too low. So when blood glucose levels are under 100 milligrams per deciliter, then really kind of the opposite system kicks in. So there is another hormone. So insulin is a hormone. It's not an enzyme, it's a hormone. Glucagon is a hormone. And guess what? Glucagon is also made by the pancreas. Glucagon stimulates the liver and the muscles that are holding on to glycogen inside the cells to break it down and release it back into the blood as glucose, and that will cause the free glucose level of the blood to go back up. So it counteracts. So this is called glycogenolysis. Man, you're going to have to say that out loud. Glycogenolysis. The lysis, splitting of glycogen. So breakdown of glycogen, and when you break down glycogen, that makes free glucose. And then also the putting of that into the blood. Let's say your body breaks down all of the glycogen through this process, and then you still don't eat. Then you'll switch into the next mode, which is called gluconeogenesis. Oh my gosh, I think I just had a flashback from my biochemistry class in graduate school. Because the professor, I swear, he talked about this constantly. Everything was gluconeogenesis, but I digress. Gluconeogenesis means, neo means new, genesis means to create. So to create new glucose, which is not very helpful, honestly, because what does that mean? Well, it means to create glucose from something that's not glucose. And typically what that means is different organic compounds, including fat, through enzymatic steps that we're not going to go through, can be reconfigured into glucose or reconfigured into what we would call something like glucose and released into the blood. So this is really, if you want to lose weight, this is where you need to be. You need to be in gluconeogenesis, which is that ketogenesis, because it makes ketones. When you break down fat, it makes ketones, so we call it ketogenesis, the creation of ketones. So gluconeogenesis is the ketogenesis phase. It's when your body has used, when you're not eating carbohydrates, and you're not even getting enough carbohydrate to keep your glucagon levels up, or sorry, your glycogen levels up, then your body turns to fat. So that's where you want to be for weight loss. You got to be in this phase. As soon as you eat some carbs, though, you go immediately out of ketogenesis and you're back at starting over again. So you got to keep yourself in gluconeogenesis for a long time to lose weight. That's hard to do. Especially when you like Oreo cookies the way I do. But it can be done. All right. So glycogenolysis, that word, the breakdown of glycogen to release the free sugars into the blood. When glycogen is all used up, then your body switches to gluconeogenesis, which in part involves turning fat into things that your body will be able to use like sugar. So there's a lot of information there that I just gave you. This picture just shows a nice overview of the whole system and some summary of what's happening at each stage. So I just think it's nice. All right. I linked up this video for you to watch. It's a guy who swallows a pill camera, and you can see what happens as the camera moves through all of his alimentary canal. It's kind of funny. And that's the end of my lecture.